For the sake of the country and of your own happiness, I call upon you to march with me under the banner of freedom.
He's the hero who saved the world from tyranny, the Lion of Britain who stared down the Nazis. But while he inspired a nation, his government's policies helped cause one of history's most devastating and hidden famines. This is the story of how Winston Churchill's wartime cabinet oversaw a catastrophe that left millions in Bengal to starve. Think of Winston Churchill. What comes to mind? A bulldog spirit? A cigar? That defiant V for victory? He's the man who saved Britain in its darkest hour. The man whose speeches gave a terrified nation the will to fight. In our collective memory, he's the uncomplicated hero of World War II. That's the story we're all told. A story of good versus evil, of moral clarity and heroic leadership. But history is rarely that simple. For millions in a corner of the British Empire, the story of Winston Churchill isn't about salvation. It's about starvation, and an indifference that challenges the very foundation of his legacy. In 1943, as war raged in Europe, a different kind of horror was unfolding in Bengal, a province of British India. This wasn't a horror of bombs and bullets. It was a slow, agonizing slide into mass starvation. This was the Bengal famine. An estimated 2 to 4 million people died. And here's the first shocking truth. This was not a natural disaster. We think of famines being caused by drought, but science confirms there was no catastrophic lack of rain. In fact, rainfall was above average. No, this was a man-made crisis. It was born from a toxic mix of war, disastrous policy, and colonial prejudice. At the center of the government in London was Winston Churchill. The evidence reveals a chain of decisions and a pattern of neglect that led directly to the death toll. This is the chapter often torn out of the history books. So what really happened? It all starts in 1942. The Second World War reaches India's doorstep when the Japanese Empire conquers Burma. Why does that matter? Because Burma was the world's biggest rice exporter, and that single event cut off a crucial supply of rice to Bengal. Panic sets in. Then things get worse. In October 1942, a massive cyclone slams coastal Bengal. It floods farmland and wipes out a huge part of the winter rice crop. This disaster, plus the loss of Burmese rice, created a serious food shortage. This was a crisis, but it wasn't a full-blown famine. Yet, the food shortfall, while serious, wasn't catastrophic. In fact, some estimates suggest the total food available in Bengal in 1943 was only slightly lower than in previous years when no famine occurred. The ingredients for a disaster were there, but it would take human hands to turn this crisis into a deadly apocalypse. As fear of a Japanese invasion grew, British authorities in India made disastrous decisions. First was the denial policy. To stop the Japanese from using local resources, the British Army seized or destroyed surplus rice in coastal areas. This only pushed panicked farmers to hoard what little they had left. At the same time, they launched a boat denial policy. Thousands of civilian boats, the lifeblood of the region's economy, were seized or destroyed. This single move crippled local trade, stopped fishermen from working, and paralyzed the movement of food within Bengal. On top of all this, runaway inflation from wartime spending. The price of rice skyrocketed. Speculators bought up grain, betting prices would climb even higher. Suddenly, for millions of ordinary people, their wages were worthless. Food was in the markets, but they couldn't afford it. Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen called this an entitlement failure. It was a famine caused not by a lack of food, but by people's inability to buy it. The crisis was spiraling, but why didn't London step in? With the situation spiraling, desperate calls for help went from India to London. The Viceroy and India's Secretary of State, Leo Amery, repeatedly warned Churchill's war cabinet about the unfolding disaster. They begged for emergency food shipments, over 1 million tons of grain to feed the starving. The response from Churchill's cabinet? Dismissal. The requests were denied or drastically cut. The excuse? Every ship was needed for the war in Europe. An offer of aid from Canada was even turned down. And yet London did manage to find shipping for supplies from Australia. But the excuse about shipping doesn't tell the whole story. Journalist Madhusri Mukherjee in her book Churchill's Secret War, found shipping records suggesting Allied food vessels passed right by India. Other historians argue that diverting those ships was too dangerous. But here's what's undeniable. Rice was still being exported from India to supply other parts of the empire. And the British government was building up huge food stockpiles in Britain for use after the war. And here the story gets darker. In private diaries, Secretary of State Leo Amery recorded Churchill's shocking attitude. He wrote that Churchill blamed the Indians for the famine, saying they were breeding like rabbits. When pressed on the crisis, Churchill reportedly shot back, "If the famine was so bad, why wasn't Gandhi dead yet?" Now, it's crucial to state these are from diary entries, and their context is debated, but they paint a picture of a leader's dismissive view of the crisis. Real action was only taken in October 1943. This was months after the famine began, and only after horrific photos from Calcutta were published around the world. Churchill appointed a new viceroy, Lord Wavell, who immediately used the army to organize relief. Significant aid did arrive, with over 1 million tons of grain shipped to India between late 1943 and 1944. But for millions of people, it was far too late. The result was a scene from hell. It started in the countryside. With no food and no work, entire villages were wiped out. Families sold everything they owned for just a few handfuls of rice. And when that ran out, they starved. Eyewitnesses described a silent, creeping death. People became too weak to even beg. They would simply lie down and die. The social fabric of Bengal disintegrated. Men abandoned their families. Women and children flooded the city of Calcutta, desperately hoping for help. But the city offered no salvation. The streets became an open-air graveyard. Every morning, trucks collected the bodies of those who had died overnight. The living were like walking skeletons, and with their immune systems shattered, disease swept in. Cholera, malaria. In the end, disease killed even more people than starvation itself. It was a complete societal breakdown, a horror on an unimaginable scale. So, was Winston Churchill responsible? This question is at the heart of a fierce historical debate. His defenders make their case. Churchill was fighting a world war for the survival of civilization. Every resource had to be focused on defeating the Axis. They point to the perfect storm of causes: the Japanese invasion, the cyclone, an incompetent local government, and greedy Indian merchants. They say blaming one man 5,000 miles away is too simple. And they rightly note that aid was eventually sent under a new viceroy he appointed. But the evidence against his government is damning. Churchill didn't create the initial food shortage, but his cabinet's policies turned a crisis into an apocalypse. The denial policies wrecked the local economy. The refusal to block aid while his own officials begged for it led to countless deaths. Churchill's personal contempt for Indians suggests he saw the famine not as a human tragedy, but as an annoying distraction from the real war in Europe. The War Cabinet had the information. They had the resources to act. They chose not to. The decision to stockpile food for post-war Britain, while millions of British subjects starved in Bengal, is a moral judgment that's impossible to ignore. Many factors caused the famine, but the argument that Churchill's cabinet bears significant responsibility for the death toll is supported by a mountain of evidence. The Bengal famine forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Our heroes are never perfect. History isn't a simple story of good and evil. Churchill was a complex man. He was the leader who defied Hitler and saved Western democracy. He was also an unapologetic imperialist whose government oversaw a preventable catastrophe that killed millions. Remembering this famine isn't about erasing Churchill's achievements. It's about demanding a more honest picture of our past. It's about acknowledging that the savior of London was also the man whose government let millions starve in Bengal. The two facts are not mutually exclusive. They are tragically intertwined, and they force us to rethink what it means to be a hero. The victims of Bengal deserve to have their story told, not as a footnote, but as a central chapter in the history of the Second World War. Does this change how you see Churchill? Hero, villain, or something much more complicated? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for more deep dives into the hidden parts of history, make sure to subscribe.